listener to the Campfire Cult podcast. From a camper van deep in the haunted woods, I bring you first-hand accounts of chilling encounters with the paranormal. Step into the night and take a peek into the realm where reality and the supernatural collide. My name is Jazz, and I'll be your host. Welcome back, campers. Tonight we're talking about the kind of scary that doesn't jump out from behind a tree. It just quietly edits the timeline when you're not looking. These stories live in the gaps. A normal night shift that ends with hours missing, boots untied, and a body covered in bruises that shouldn't be there. A familiar hike in the middle of Los Angeles that suddenly turns into silence, disorientation, and a sunset you didn't earn. Highways that feel like they loop, tunnels that somehow get skipped, and drives where you blink and you're miles away with no memory of the roads in between. And it's not just missing time. Sometimes it's time condensing down to almost nothing. Sometimes it's rooms changing, people showing up where they can't be, or reality doing that subtle little stutter where you're left thinking, no, that didn't happen like that. We've got doppelganger moments, reset moments, and a few stories that feel like they brush up against something bigger than a simple lapse. So kill the lights, get comfortable, and keep an eye on the clock. Because the unsettling part isn't what you hear tonight, it's what you can't account for afterward. Let's begin. First up, a San Antonio security guard finishes paperwork at 11 p.m., then wakes up walking a highway at 4 a.m. 5 hours missing and no idea how he got there.
I'm an armed security guard in San Antonio, Texas. At the time, I was working the late shift downtown, guarding a news station. Around 11 p.m., I was finishing up my paperwork like I usually do at the end of a shift. I remember writing down 2300 on the report, and that's the last clear thing I remember. The next thing I knew, I was walking down the side of a highway at about 4 in the morning. A woman and her son stopped and picked me up. I had no idea where I was. They drove me to a convenience store so I could make a phone call. I called my son, and he came and got me. It took him about an hour to get there. When we started putting the timeline together, it turned out I had about 5 hours of missing time. When I got home, I slept for about a day and a half. When I finally woke up and really looked at myself, I noticed I had bruises all over my legs and arms. But the strange part was my uniform was perfectly clean, so it didn't look like I had fallen or gotten into any kind of accident. I also had no idea how I ended up way out there. It took me about a week to track down my pickup truck. I eventually had to call the sheriff's office and ask them to help locate it. They found it parked on the side of the highway, perfectly fine. Not a scratch on it. I hadn't wrecked it or anything, it was just sitting there, and it never happened again. So that's the weird part of it, about 5 or 6 hours completely missing, some bruises and no explanation. When I was asked what I think happened, honestly, I don't know. The last thing I remember is filling out that paperwork at the end of my shift. Then somehow I ended up way out past Wallersville, which is east of Houston. Another strange thing was when they found my truck. All my gear was inside it. My weapon, my gun belt, everything. I never take that stuff off until I get home. My wallet and everything else were in the truck too. My shirt was untucked, my boots were untied, and somehow I was just wandering down the highway. For about a week after that, my head felt really off. Just strange. My friend even asked if maybe I slipped on ice and hit my head. But this was San Antonio. There's no ice in the summertime.
Stories like this are hard to pin down because there's no clean ending, no bright light in the sky, no clear explanation, just a normal night that suddenly has 5 hours missing from it. 1 minute he's finishing paperwork at the station, and the next he's miles away walking along a highway with bruises he can't account for and his truck sitting somewhere else entirely. Maybe there's a simple explanation buried in there somewhere, or maybe it's one of those moments where something happened and the mind just never got the full story. Either way, that gap in time is the part that really would bother me. Not knowing how you got from one place to another, that's the kind of thing that would stay with you for a long time. Next, a Griffith Park hiker repeatedly experiences eerie silence and missing hours, only to find herself miles from where she started,
I don't drink, I don't smoke, and I don't do drugs. Whenever I went hiking, I always told my brother where I planned to go. Sometimes I'd hike with friends, but a lot of the time I was out there on my own. Still, my brother or my friends always knew what trail I'd be on. And the thing about Griffith Park is that even if you got turned around, if you just kept walking downhill, you'd eventually hit civilization. You're never that far from something, unless you somehow wander all the way out near the zoo. But even then, there are still roads and cars passing through. I loved being out there early in the morning. Right when the sun started coming up, the birds would start up too, and the park had this really peaceful feeling to it. I was a slow hiker back then because I was pretty out of shape. I used to joke with my friends that if a mountain lion ever decided to make a meal out of me, I'd probably give it indigestion. I definitely would have been easy prey. I carried pepper spray, which probably gave me more confidence than it should have. Sometimes I brought a walking stick too, mostly for safety, although half the time it just felt like it got in the way. I planned my hikes pretty carefully. I'd study the maps, decide which trails I wanted to explore, and then text my brother or a friend to let them know the plan. I was almost always a morning hiker. Some days I'd spend 6 or 8 hours on the trails, sometimes even 12, but I always made sure I got back to my Kia Soul before sunset. I never planned hikes that ran into the night. Usually I'd hike the same trails again and again until I felt really comfortable with them. Once my body got used to the terrain, the routes, the climbs, then I'd switch things up and try a new route. The first strange thing happened in 2005 in Griffith Park. The park sits right in the middle of the city, between Burbank and Los Angeles. The Hollywood sign is right there. For me, it felt like my backyard. Over the course of about 3.5 years, I ended up hiking almost every trail in that park, many of them several times. At the time, I was unemployed but doing contract work, which meant my schedule was flexible. I could hike almost every day, and honestly, I got addicted to it. When I hiked on the observatory side of the park, I'd usually park near the bird sanctuary or the observatory lot. I always started early, usually right before sunrise. By the time the sun actually came up, I'd already be on the trail, and I'd head home sometime in the late afternoon or early evening. One morning, around 5 in the morning, I started up the bird trail. It was still dark. My plan was to hike up to the observatory and watch the sunrise from there. Pretty early on, I got that familiar feeling people talk about, the sense that you're being watched. But it's the middle of a big city park, so I didn't think much of it. Even when the trails get quiet, there's usually still some background noise. Wind in the trees, birds, and way off in the distance, the low hum of Los Angeles traffic. But as I climbed the trail, something changed. Everything went silent. Not quiet. Silent. Completely silent. It felt like the sound had just been sucked out of the air, almost like a vacuum. I'd later learn that some people call it the Oz effect. It lasted for what felt like maybe 30 minutes while I was walking through a series of switchbacks. The entire time I still had that feeling of being watched, but there weren't supposed to be mountain lions in that area, so I just stayed alert and kept moving. Eventually, I walked out of that silent zone and suddenly everything came back all at once. Birds, wind, distant traffic. It actually sounded loud when it returned. At the time, I thought maybe something was wrong with me. I wondered if I'd temporarily lost my hearing or something. I told a few other hikers about it later, but none of them had experienced anything like that. It was strange, but it didn't stop me from hiking. About 7 months later, sometime around November, I had a second experience. I was hiking near Taco Peak. I'd been on the trail for about 2 hours when I walked into that same kind of silent zone again. The next thing I remember, it was hours later. I had lost track of time completely. When I came to my senses, I was on a completely different trail. The sun was already starting to set, and I realized I was on the Fire Break Trail, on the opposite side of where I had planned to hike that day. In fact, at that point, I hadn't even explored that side of the park yet. I was confused, disoriented, and honestly pretty scared. I ended up calling my twin brother. He and a couple of his friends got in the car and came looking for me. By the time they found me, it was around 6 in the evening. I was exhausted and I started crying because I couldn't explain what had happened. From his perspective, it looked like I'd just been wandering the trails alone for 14 hours, but I had no memory of most of that time. The weird part was that I had to have been walking the whole time. I was sweating, I was dirty like I'd been off the trail, and my muscles were aching all over. But when I checked my bag, my sandwich was still cold. The bread wasn't smashed or soggy. My water pack still had water in it, my food bar was untouched. At one point, I even checked my clothes because I was scared something might have happened to me, and I had somehow blocked it out. But there were no signs of anything like that. The whole experience disturbed me so much that I threw away the clothes I'd been wearing that day. I just didn't want to put them on again. I didn't hike for several weeks after that. It shook me up pretty badly, but eventually I went back. I missed it too much. Then, less than a year later, around August of 2006, it happened again. That day I planned to start at the Bird Trail, head toward Riverside Trail, then up Hog back to Dante's View, and eventually loop down Brew Trail. Somewhere near Dante's View, I lost time again. The next thing I remember, I was on the complete opposite side of the park near the zoo, standing on the Condor Trail, way off course. The sun was already going down. I remember walking down Skyline Trail in near darkness and waiting under a streetlight for my brother to come pick me up. The only reason I knew roughly where I was because I could see the I-5 freeway nearby. I didn't even tell my brother about the missing time that time. I knew he'd give me grief about hiking alone again. After that, I started carrying a flashlight, and I even began bringing a small recorder with me on hikes. I was worried I was losing hours of time and didn't know why. Part of me wondered if I was losing my mind. There's some mental illness in my family, so that thought was always sitting there in the back of my mind. But that third time was different in another way. I wasn't sweaty or dirty like the first incident. It almost felt like I had just been dropped there, like I'd only just started hiking. I had a slight headache and some body aches, but nothing severe. I remember a couple passing me and asking if I was okay. I told them I was fine and kept walking. To this day, I'm not even sure how much of that memory is clear and how much of it is a blur. What's strange is that during these experiences, I never felt the kind of fear other people describe. I mostly felt confused and disoriented. I never saw anything unusual, never heard anything strange. I just couldn't explain how hours of time disappeared. At one point, I even joked to myself that maybe I'd been abducted by aliens. I still kept hiking. The last experience happened years later, and this time my teenage son was with me. We were living in Petersburg, Illinois for a few months. One evening, we went to the local school track. I was sore from lifting weights earlier that day, so I planned to just walk while he ran laps. It was around 9 at night, and the place was completely empty. We walked one lap together. Then he took off running while I kept walking. A little while later, I suddenly got this overwhelming feeling that we were being watched. Not just watched, threatened. I kept looking over the fence toward this pitch-black field next to the track, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My son ran over to me, and before either of us even said anything, we both had the exact same reaction. We needed to leave. Right now. We ran to his truck. He was fumbling with the keys trying to get the door open. We jumped inside and drove off, both of us yelling, "Go! Go!" at the same time. As soon as we got a few blocks away, the feeling vanished. We both just started laughing from the adrenaline. We still can't explain what that was. My husband thinks we probably just fed off each other's emotions. Maybe that's true. But the thing that still bothers me the most isn't that night. It's those missing hours on the trails. That's the part I've never been able to explain. And believe me, I've tried.
This is a strange one. Griffith Park sits right in the middle of Los Angeles, surrounded by neighborhoods and traffic, but once you're up in those hills, it can still feel surprisingly remote. The silence she described is something hikers talk about sometimes, that sudden moment when the woods seem to shut off. But the missing time and ending up on the other side of the park, that's harder to explain. Sometimes the strangest experiences don't come with monsters or lights in the sky. Sometimes it's just time, disappearing, and that might be even harder to wrap your head around. Up next, a family driving through the New Mexico desert hits a strange roadblock, a blinding flash, and somehow ends up a mile back on the same highway.
Back on July 4th, 1991, my family and I experienced something strange while driving along Interstate 40 near Gallup, New Mexico. I know it sounds unbelievable, but after everything that's happened to me over the years, it's hard for me to dismiss it. My family has deep roots in New Mexico. My father was born in Roswell in 1904. Our family originally came from Norway and ended up in the Southwest while working on the railroads. In 1916, my grandfather was killed in Las Vegas, New Mexico. And after that, my father went to live with his aunt in Roswell. He rarely talked about his past. Growing up, I always had the feeling that strange things seemed to follow our family whenever we were in that part of the country. Every summer, my father would take me back to New Mexico, and whenever we got near Gallup or into the high desert, something unusual would happen. It became common enough that eventually I stopped reacting to it. In 1987, when I was living in Tucson, I started seeing lights in the sky. One night, I followed them out into the desert and ended up in a situation where the police had to help me get back. After that, explaining what happened turned into its own ordeal. And ever since then, people have had a hard time taking my experiences seriously. Even now, whenever I return to New Mexico, I sometimes feel like I'm being watched. I've always wondered if whatever is happening is somehow connected to my family history. The night of the incident in 1991, we were driving from Flagstaff toward Albuquerque. My wife was driving. Our 14-year-old daughter and 12-year-old son were in the back seat, and I was in the passenger seat. Somewhere west of Gallup, we noticed flashing yellow lights ahead on the road. At first, it looked like some kind of road work or checkpoint. As we got closer, we realized it looked like a roadblock set up right there in the middle of the desert. There were several figures standing along a narrowed single lane of traffic. They were wearing yellow reflective gear and what looked like hooded coverings. But something about it felt off. Every one of them was facing the wrong direction, turned away from oncoming traffic. Their posture felt strange, almost staged. As we entered the narrow lane, it suddenly felt like the pavement disappeared beneath us. Then everything went dark. A bright flash of light filled the car, and in the next instant we were back on the highway, but about a mile earlier, as if the car had been moved or the moment had somehow reset. We kept driving. After a while, I started noticing something strange. The hills on our left looked familiar. Too familiar. It felt like we were passing the same place again. My son suddenly started screaming because he noticed it too. My wife, who tends to stay calm in situations like that, just kept driving until we reached Gallup. We checked into a hotel for the night, but even there, something felt off. The whole place had a strange, almost dream-like mood. Around 2 a.m, we decided to go out and get something to eat. The people around us seemed slowed down somehow, like time wasn't moving at the same speed. Our waiter brought the menus upside down and struggled with simple things. Everyone we encountered seemed confused or detached, like they weren't completely present. I tried to stay calm so my kids wouldn't panic, but the whole environment felt disoriented. The next day there were even more strange moments, but eventually we decided to cut the trip short and drive back to Phoenix. Years later, when my son was about 25, he suddenly asked me something out of the blue. He said, "Dad, did we ever take a trip where we passed the same mountain twice?" That memory stuck with him all those years, even though we hardly ever talked about that night. To this day, I believe something took our car that night. I think we were moved somewhere, examined, and then placed back slightly before the moment we were taken. When we drove past that same stretch of highway again, the roadblock was gone. No workers, no flashing lights, nothing. Just empty desert. Over the years, I've also seen similar hooded figures in Tucson. Once I saw a group of them standing around what looked like a light pole repair in the middle of the night. When I walked toward them, they scattered almost instantly. My husband had his own strange experience as a child in Reno, where a craft was reportedly seen landing in his yard. My father also had unusual encounters during his time in World War II. It sometimes makes me wonder if whatever intelligence is behind these events follows certain families. Maybe they know who they can observe without causing too much disruption. One time in California, I even stepped outside during a legal deposition and saw a contrail appear in the sky out of nowhere. It was just suddenly there. Personally, I don't believe these beings are working with the United States government. I don't think there's some massive cover-up happening, because I'm not convinced they need governments at all. It feels more like they move through our world on their own terms, and once in a while we just happen to cross paths with them. Maybe some of the frightening encounters people report are simply misunderstandings between two completely different species. I sometimes wish I had reported everything when it happened, but at the time I knew exactly how it would sound, and I knew no one would believe me.
Coming up, a late-night drive turns strange when a car accelerates on its own. The couple wakes hours later in a cornfield and can't account for the lost time.
I live in Beloit, Wisconsin, and this happened on June 1st, 1992. At the time, my girlfriend, who later became my wife, and I were driving around the country roads in southern Wisconsin late at night, or really early in the morning. We had been drinking a little, but we weren't drunk, and there were no drugs involved. Out of nowhere, the car I was driving suddenly accelerated on its own. I wasn't pressing the gas, and I couldn't control it. The last clear thing I remember is us leaving the road and heading straight into a cornfield. I instinctively threw my arm across my girlfriend's chest and told her to hang on. When we entered the cornfield, it was about 2:14 a.m. Central Time. For some reason, that exact time has always stuck in my head. Eventually, the car came to a stop more than 400 yards off the road. It was wedged right up against a huge oak tree, so close that the front of the car was only about a foot away from it. When we came to, we were both confused. We also realized we were only partially clothed, which made no sense because we definitely hadn't gotten into the car that way. Even stranger, it was now daylight. We just looked at each other, trying to understand what had happened. I got out of the car to try to figure things out. I walked around looking at where we had ended up and tried to retrace our path through the cornfield, but there were no tire tracks, no crushed corn, nothing that showed a car had driven through there for over 400 yards. The only damage to the car was a flat tire. To this day, I've never been able to find the exact place where this happened. I tried looking for it not long after the incident, and I knew those roads pretty well, but I couldn't figure it out. Since I was about 5 years old, I've seen unidentified craft in the sky from time to time, so this wasn't completely outside the realm of what I'd experienced before. And honestly, the experiences haven't stopped.
Next, a couple driving the Pennsylvania Turnpike remembers passing the tunnel's exit sign, but neither recalls entering or driving through it.
On December 26, 2025, my husband and I were driving north on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, heading home toward Bloomsburg from the Philadelphia area. I was behind the wheel and he was awake in the passenger seat the whole time. We were both talking and paying attention to the drive. We make that trip pretty regularly, usually every month or two because our daughter lives in Philadelphia. So the route is familiar to us, including the drive through the Lehigh Tunnel, also called the Blue Mountain Tunnel. At one point during the drive, I said out loud that it felt strange we hadn't gone through the tunnel yet. My husband said he didn't know why either. Then almost immediately, we both realized something that didn't make sense. We clearly remembered seeing the Jim Thorpe billboard on the left side of the road. The thing is, that billboard is past the tunnel. If we saw that sign, it meant we had already gone through it. But neither of us remembered entering the tunnel, driving through it, or coming out the other side. It wasn't like we were tired or distracted. Neither of us had fallen asleep. We were both awake the entire time. The memory of that stretch of road is just gone. Everything else about the trip was normal, except for that one part. We made it home without any problems. The drive took about 2.5 hours, which included 2 stops. We got gas in Balasinwood and stopped at a McDonald's in Quakertown. The trip was maybe a little shorter than usual, but not by enough to immediately raise any alarms. What bothered me more was how I felt the next day. I had this lingering sense that something wasn't quite right. I felt mentally foggy and a little disoriented, which isn't normal for me. Throughout the day, I caught myself making small mistakes and bad judgment calls that I normally wouldn't make. That feeling lasted more than a full day after the drive. My husband and I have both had other strange experiences over the years. Things we couldn't easily explain, like unusual sounds or sightings. Looking back at this one, the only way we can really describe it is that something happened during that stretch of road. It almost feels like we passed through some kind of gap, like a piece of time just went missing.
Coming up, a night hunt turns strange when silent spheres pace two hunters through the woods, while their brother vanishes for hours he never experienced. While deer hunting near a military base outside Jefferson, Indiana on November 17, 1985, our hunting group headed out into woods we knew well. It was the same group we'd hunted with for years: my dad, his friend Davey, my brother Rodney, and me. We'd been hunting those woods for over a decade. That particular year had been slow. After a few seasons without taking a deer, Rodney, Davey, and I made a bad decision. We figured we'd sneak out and try to poach one at night while my dad was asleep back at camp. He was strict about hunting laws, so if he'd known what we were planning, it would have been the end of it right there. After opening weekend, most of the other hunters usually headed home, but we always stayed the full week. That meant the woods were quiet and mostly empty. Once my dad was asleep, the three of us slipped down a gravel firebreak road and walked about a mile into the woods. The moonlight was decent that night. We ended up sitting on a large fallen log beside a small pond, just waiting and watching. That's when we noticed a bright light down the road, maybe a mile away. At first it looked like one of those big searchlight stores used during sales promotions, the kind that sweep across the sky. But something about this one felt wrong. It wasn't high up, it was low, maybe treetop height, and the way it moved didn't look like any spotlight I'd ever seen. As the light started coming toward us, Rodney thought I was overreacting. He kept saying it was probably just some kind of promotional light from town. But Davey and I both had a bad feeling about it. Our first thought was that maybe it was the police, and if they caught us out there, we'd be in serious trouble. We argued for a moment, trying to convince Rodney to leave with us. Finally, Davey and I decided we weren't waiting around to find out what it was. Just before we took off, I looked back at Rodney and told him to hurry up. When I did, I saw the light closing the distance fast, much faster than it should have been able to. Davey and I took off running back toward camp. Rodney stayed behind by a tree with his shotgun. I was carrying the spotlight. As we ran, I glanced over my right shoulder and saw something that made my stomach drop. Right beside me was a bright white sphere, maybe 3 or 4 feet across. Around it was a thin, glowing blue ring. Oddly, it didn't seem to cast any light of its own. I looked over at Davey to see if he noticed it, and that's when I realized he was staring at another one on his side. There was no sound at all. It was late fall, so the trees were bare and the ground was covered in leaves, but I couldn't hear anything. No wind, no insects, nothing. The sphere stayed right beside me as we ran, maybe 5 feet away, and as it moved past the trees, something strange happened. Whatever it passed in front of looked magnified. A tiny insect on the bark suddenly looked huge, like the size of a small animal. Those lights kept pace with us for about 300 yards. Then, about 100 yards from camp, they simply disappeared. Once we caught our breath, Davey and I started arguing about what to do next. Should we wake my dad and explain everything, knowing we'd get in serious trouble, or should we go back and find Rodney ourselves? In the end, we grabbed our shotguns and bigger spotlights and headed back down the road, but almost immediately something felt off. It was completely silent. Not even a cricket was chirping. We swept our lights through the woods and started whispering, calling out, "Rodney, it's okay, come on out." We kept doing that the whole way back to where we'd last seen him, but when we got there, he was gone. We kept walking the road, calling his name the entire way back toward camp, still nothing. Then we started yelling for him, our voices echoing through the ridges. We walked the road to the end and back again. By that point, we'd been searching for about 2 hours. I really didn't want to wake my dad. I knew exactly how much trouble I'd be in. But we retraced our steps again anyway, walking past the spot where we left Rodney over and over. Eventually, we gave up and went back to camp. I woke my dad and told him everything. After hearing the story, he told Davey to drive into town and get the police. Davey had just started heading for the car when Rodney suddenly walked out of the woods. He looked completely calm. I ran over to him and asked where he'd been. He said he finished his cigarette and then walked back to camp the way we normally did, which usually took around 30 or 45 minutes. I told him we'd been out there searching for him for nearly 3 hours. He laughed and said we had to be joking. Then he looked at his watch and said it was only 9:15. Davey and I looked down at ours. Our watches said 11:50. Even now, Rodney always insisted we were messing with him. Not long before he passed away, the two of us talked about that night again. He asked me one last time if we'd been playing a prank or if something strange had actually happened to him. That was the last time we ever hunted those woods. The four of us didn't talk about that night for years, and after it happened, Rodney was never quite the same. Even now, I still don't like being in the woods at night. Up next, a truck driver loses 4 hours on a routine route. His GPS record vanishes near Moriarty and reappears in Oklahoma City with no memory of the drive.
I'm a long-haul truck driver, and my truck is equipped with a GPS and a computer system that tracks my driving to make sure I'm always staying within legal limits. One night around 7 p.m., I left Moriarty, New Mexico, heading east towards Springfield, Missouri. It's a drive I've done plenty of times. I got settled in, started putting miles behind me, and everything felt normal. Then the next thing I knew, I was pulling into a gas station in Oklahoma City. I looked at the clock and it was about 5 a.m. The drive usually takes around 7 hours. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured I'd just been cruising through the night and maybe I was a little tired. But something about it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like I had actually driven that whole stretch. The best way I can describe it is that it felt like I had watched myself drive rather than experienced it. It was strange, but I still had a few hours left on my driving clock, so I just kept going. Later that morning, around 8 a.m., my phone rang. It was my boss. He asked me, "What did you do to your truck?" I had no idea what he was talking about. I said, "What do you mean? What did I do to my truck?" He told me my truck had disappeared from GPS about 40 miles east of Moriarty, New Mexico, and then suddenly showed back up again at 5 a.m. in Oklahoma City. He said, "You must have done something. Did you pull a fuse so you could drive illegally?" I told him, "No, I've never driven illegally in my life." He still seemed unsure, so he transferred me to another manager who handles legal compliance for the company. She pulled up my logs and started going through them. She said, "Your logbook doesn't match. According to the system, you were stationary for 4 hours during that 9-hour stretch." I was completely confused. I asked her what could cause something like that. She said pretty casually, "Oh, this happens sometimes." I asked her what she meant by sometimes. She said it happens 2 or 3 times a week. That caught me off guard. I asked her what actually causes it because I obviously didn't want something like that happening again. She told me the company just calls it a computer glitch. I said, "I've seen glitches before, but those last a few minutes. Maybe 5. This was 4 hours. Under normal circumstances, I probably would have just shrugged it off and moved on. But the more I thought about it, the stranger it felt. Somehow I had ended up in Oklahoma City with no clear memory of the drive itself. When I try to think back on it, it's like the whole thing is behind a fog. I know I made the trip, I know I was driving, but I can't recall any details from that stretch of road. And that's unusual for me. When you drive the same routes over and over again, you remember the little things. A blown tire sitting on the shoulder at a certain mile marker. A strange billboard. A construction zone you have to slow down for. I remember details like that all the time. But from Moriarty to Oklahoma City that night, there's nothing. Just the feeling that I watched it happen instead of actually being there.
This one really leaves you with a strange feeling. Anyone who's driven long distances knows the rhythm of the road. You settle in, you watch the mile markers, you remember the little things along the way. And this guy clearly knows that route well enough to recall details from past trips. But that night there's just nothing. No landmarks, no moments from the drive, just a gap. The GPS dropping out at the exact same time doesn't exactly make it easier to explain either. The company calls it a glitch, and maybe it is. Big fleets run a lot of equipment, and systems fail sometimes. Still, losing 4 hours and having no memory of the road during that time would bother anyone, especially someone whose job is literally built around watching every mile go by. Real quick, when I'm away from the campfire and not producing this show, I'm a brand designer and coffee roaster. Last year, I launched my own coffee brand called Outlands Coffee. If you love damn good coffee and want to support a fiercely independent small business while also supporting this podcast, head over to outlandscoffee.com and give us a shot. I roast to order, single origin perfection alongside a couple of bold, adventurous blends, crafted for those who take their coffee as seriously as their campfire stories. Here in Washington, we don't just believe in Bigfoot, we believe in great coffee too. Try it for yourself. Use code CAMPFIRE for $5 off your first order. Now, back to the show. Next up, a teen sees his friend's brother walking near parked cars at night. only to walk back inside and find him already there, waiting for him. This happened back in 2008 at a friend's place. When we were teenagers, he had this amazing shed out behind his house that we basically treated like our weekend hangout spot. It was fully set up. 4 sets of bunk beds, tables, a fireplace, a TV, a fridge, the whole thing. We'd spend a lot of nights out there just hanging out. One night we were all inside when I stepped out because I needed to go to the bathroom. I walked out the front door of the shed and started heading to the right, but I stopped almost immediately. To explain the layout a bit, when you walk out of the shed, the house is off to the left. To the right is where we parked all our cars, and beyond that, it opens up into empty fields and a few trees. It was already dark out. The lights from the house lit up the space between the house and the cars, but the light faded off just past them. As I took a step to the right, planning to go behind the cars, I noticed my friend's older brother standing out there. I watched him for a good 5 or 10 seconds. He was just standing there facing out toward the darkness. After a moment, he started walking, moved behind a couple of trees and one of the cars, and then disappeared from view. I thought it was a little odd, so I turned around and went back into the shed and asked my friend what his brother was doing out by the cars. The conversation went something like this. Me: "Hey man, what's your brother doing out by the cars?" Him: "What do you mean?" Me: "I just saw him walk off behind them." Then his brother spoke up from across the room. "Hey, I'm right here." I looked over, and sure enough, he was sitting in a chair with a drink in his hand. Same clothes I'd just seen outside. And the weird part was, the only way into the shed was through the door I had just walked through, the same doorway I had been standing in. To this day, I still have no idea what I saw. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the thing that always stuck with me is that I watched him for a solid 10 seconds. It wasn't just a quick glance or something in the corner of my eye. And I've never had anything like that happen before or since. Coming up, a man leaves a Dallas hospital and drives home. 9 minutes later, he's 15 miles away near Love Field with no memory of how he got there.
My girlfriend came down with a non-COVID illness that ended up putting her in the hospital. I drove her there, got her checked in, and then called her sister, who lives out of state, to let her know what was going on. This was in the middle of the day. I wasn't speeding, and my plan was simple: take the side road all the way home. The hospital is about 11 miles north of my house, and I know this part of Dallas, Texas, like the back of my hand. Instead of taking the tollway, I decided to use a familiar side road I've driven plenty of times. Her sister and I had been talking on speakerphone for about 9 minutes when something started to feel off. The road I was on, one I knew well, suddenly looked unfamiliar. Then it hit me. I was approaching Love Field Airport, which is about 6 miles south of my house. I pulled over right away. My hands were shaking. Her sister and I checked the call time and confirmed we'd only been on the phone for 9 minutes. I had started the call as I pulled out of the hospital parking lot. Neither of us could explain how I ended up there. Once she realized what I was describing, it rattled her just as much. To get to Love Field from the hospital, I would have had to drive more than 15 miles. That route would require passing under a major freeway and crossing both a large cross street and another highway. I have absolutely no memory of doing any of that. And to cover that distance in 9 minutes, I would have had to average around 90 miles an hour on suburban roads with a 35 miles per hour speed limit. That didn't happen. I took a photo of Love Field while I was pulled over, then turned around and drove home. That drive took a little over 10 minutes, exactly what it normally takes. What's strange is that nothing about the drive itself felt unusual. Traffic looked normal. The same cars were around me. There weren't any gaps or moments where things felt like they skipped. I was just driving along like any other day, until I realized I was in a neighborhood that definitely wasn't between the hospital and my house. And it's never happened again.
Next is a weird one. After a crash and a hospital stay at 17, a teen wakes up living life as a different person, same memories, but an entirely different body.
I was a little nervous about reaching out about my event because I know how far-fetched it sounds, but I think I finally have the courage to talk about it. The best way I can describe it is a really bizarre gender glitch. I'm almost 30 now, But this happened when I was 17. Back then, I was a straight guy who had fallen in with a pretty rough crowd. One night, a few months after I got my license, I was driving home from a friend's place. It was late, and I remember feeling extremely tired behind the wheel. At one point, I realized I had drifted over the center line. The last thing I clearly remember is seeing the headlights of a tractor trailer coming straight toward me. The next thing I knew, I woke up in a hospital the following morning. At first, I assumed I'd been brought in because of the accident, but that wasn't the case. The doctor said I had appendicitis. But that's where things got strange. After a little while, I started noticing that something about me was different. The first thing I saw were my hands. They looked smaller than I remembered, and there was chipped nail polish on my fingernails. That immediately confused me. Then I looked down and realized I had breasts. At that point, I blacked out. I'm not sure if it was from the surgery, the medication, or just the shock of what I was seeing. A few hours later, I woke up again. A nurse was talking to me, asking how I felt. When I answered her, I realized my voice sounded completely different, higher. Not like my voice at all. After she left the room, I fell asleep again, hoping I'd wake up and realize it had all just been a dream. But it wasn't. My parents came and took me home. I was still in shock and honestly on the edge of a panic attack the whole time. I wanted to tell them something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Part of me thought they'd think I was insane and send me off somewhere. Another part of me wondered if I was still in a coma. When we got home, even my room felt off. Things were arranged differently than I remembered. The next morning, my family went to church like we always did. I remember struggling just to get dressed. Everything felt unfamiliar. Then my mom insisted I wear high heels. That was a disaster. I almost fell over at least 20 times trying to walk in them. I won't go through every little detail of what happened after that, but my life was clearly different. I had a different group of friends. The strange thing is, I recognized them as the popular kids from my school, even though I had never hung out with them before. I had to adjust to a lot of things very quickly. The strangest part, though, was how my thoughts and feelings slowly seemed to shift. At first, I assumed that in this strange new life, I'd probably end up being a lesbian. But that's not how things played out. Over the next few months, I noticed myself becoming attracted to men. It wasn't something I consciously decided. It just sort of happened. I even caught myself flirting with guys without thinking about it. About a year later, I had sex for the first time in that life, and honestly, it felt completely natural. The same thing happened with other things. Take the high heels, for example. That first Sunday, I could barely stand in them. By the next Sunday, I was walking in them like I'd been doing it my whole life. The same with makeup and other things. Skills would just show up, like I'd always known how to do them. That's the short version of my story. I honestly don't know what to make of it. Maybe it's some kind of glitch. Maybe it's all in my head. All I know is that my life went on. I'm now happily married and I have a 2-year-old son, so things turned out pretty normal in the end. I'm not panicked about what happened anymore. At this point, I've just accepted it and moved on with my life. One other thing that might be important, I don't remember having 2 separate sets of memories. It's not like I remember 2 different lives. There's just one continuous memory, even though the person I woke up as was completely different.
This is one of those stories that leaves you sitting with more questions than answers. Waking up after a hospital stay is confusing enough on its own, but imagining your entire life suddenly being different, your body, your friends, even how people expect you to move through the world, that's hard to wrap your head around. What's interesting here is how the memory stays continuous. There's no sense of 2 lives overlapping, just one person moving forward through a reality that somehow changed around them. Maybe there's a medical explanation buried somewhere in the details. Maybe it's a trick of memory after trauma, or maybe it's something stranger that we don't have a name for yet. Coming up, a late-night drive in Fresno turns strange when a couple finds empty roads, dark streetlights, lost time, and things acting oddly after they get home.
About 2 hours ago, my fiancé and I went out to grab some food. It's a place we go to pretty often. We got on the freeway, drove for maybe 4 minutes, and took our usual exit. After getting off the freeway, we made a left turn, and that part matters. then kept going straight like we always do. We drove for about 5 minutes when we suddenly realized something strange. There were no other cars on the road. None going our direction, none coming the other way. Now I live in Fresno, California. It's not Los Angeles or San Francisco, but it's still a big city. There's almost always at least some traffic, especially around 11:45 at night. But there was nobody, not a single car. On top of that, every street light was out. The whole road was dark. My fiance pointed it out and we both got a little uneasy, but we kind of shrugged it off at first. Then we realized something else. Somehow we were heading in the opposite direction from where we thought we were going. Like we had turned right off the exit instead of left, even though we're both sure we turned left. By that point, we'd been driving for over 10 minutes. The restaurant we were headed to is usually only about 3 minutes away from the freeway. Instead, we were at least 5 miles away and going completely the wrong direction. The whole area felt empty, not just quiet, empty. Like we were the only 2 people left in the city. It honestly felt like everyone else had just vanished. Even if we had somehow turned the wrong way, none of it really makes sense. The lack of traffic, the streetlights being off, the strange feeling in the air, and the fact that it took way longer to reach the point we were at than it should have. Once we realized we were going the wrong way, we turned the car around, and almost immediately everything was normal again. Streetlights were back on, cars were on the road, people were around. It was like flipping a switch. At that point, we were both pretty shaken, trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. When we got home, I started telling my teenage son about it. Right in the middle of the story, my iPad suddenly turned on by itself, and Siri popped up asking if she could help me. Anyone who has an Apple device knows you normally have to hold the home button down for several seconds to activate Siri. Nobody was touching it. So now we're all standing there kind of staring at it. Then about 15 minutes later, the hallway light turned on. My fiance is absolutely sure he had turned that light off earlier. At that point, we were just looking at each other, wondering what was going on. We still don't have an explanation for any of it, and honestly, it left us pretty freaked out.
Up next, a late night drive home suddenly turns black, and the driver finds themselves miles back where they started, with no time lost.
My father was in a rehab center doing physical therapy after triple bypass heart surgery. The place was about 2 towns away from my house. One night, when I was leaving the facility, I decided to take the longer route home because it was better lit. The shorter route was a dark road with no streetlights, and I never liked driving it at night. So I'm on the brighter main road heading home when a car in front of me suddenly pulls over to the side and lets me pass. I thought that was a little odd, but I went around it. The strange part was that the second I passed, the car pulled right back out and started following me, close behind, with its high beams on. A moment later, I crossed into the next town. That area has a lot of stores, restaurants, and even a hotel, so it's usually really well lit. But out of nowhere, everything went completely dark. At the same time, I heard a loud sound, like an overhead garage door slamming shut. Bang. Suddenly, I was driving on a narrow, pitch-black road with no streetlights, and the car that had been behind me was gone. I wasn't even on the same road anymore. I remember talking out loud to myself in the car. What the hell? Where am I? What just happened? A few seconds later, my headlights caught a street sign up ahead. It said Gale Road. That's when things got even stranger. Gale Road was the dark shortcut I specifically avoided when I left the rehab center. Somehow I had ended up almost all the way back near the facility, even though I had already driven into the next town on my way home. So now I had to repeat the whole drive. Except this time I had no choice but to take the dark road I didn't want to be on in the first place. My father had a habit of calling me when I got home. He knew the drive usually took about 40 minutes, so as I was driving, I kept thinking he was probably wondering why I was taking so long. I never checked the time, but I figured whatever had just happened must have added at least half an hour to my trip, maybe more. When I finally got home, the phone rang. It was my father. Before I even told him the story, I apologized for getting back so late. I asked how many times he had tried to call me. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, This is the first time I've called. It's only been about half an hour. You're not late." That's when I told him everything that had just happened. And honestly, I still have no idea what it was. Was it some kind of strange glitch? A vortex in the road? Did that car that pulled over and then followed me have anything to do with it? I really don't know. But I've always wondered if anyone else has experienced something like this.
Coming up, a man mourns a friend he believed died in a crash, only to run into her months later, alive and recovering from the same accident.
A few years ago, a good friend of ours was involved in a really serious car accident. There were 2 people in the car. The passenger, someone I didn't know, was in critical condition, and the driver, our friend, who I'll call Mary, was even worse off. Within the first 12 hours, I was told that Mary had died at the hospital. I never heard for sure what happened to the passenger, but I believe they survived. I first heard the news from another friend, and later I looked it up myself and found a news article about the crash. It listed her full first and last name, which I'll leave out here because it's a pretty unusual last name. And it included the location of the accident and details about what happened. Everything matched. For a couple days after that, I kept checking online for an obituary so I could find out when the funeral would be. Eventually, one showed up around day 2 or 3, but it said the family was holding a private service for relatives only. Death wasn't completely new to me by that point. I'd already lost a few friends over the years, but not being able to go to the funeral and say goodbye felt strange. It left things kind of unresolved. Then about 3 or 4 months passed. One day I was just going about my normal routine driving through town. I pulled up to a 4-way stop at almost the exact same time as another car. The other car stopped on the road to my right. I remember this moment really clearly. Since we arrived at about the same time, I figured I'd let them go first. I probably glanced down at my phone for a second while I waited. Then I started hearing someone yelling over the sound of the radio. At first I ignored it, but the yelling kept going, louder and more frantic. I glanced over quickly, then looked forward again. And a second later the thought hit me. No way. I looked back over, and there she was. Mary was leaning out the driver's window of the other car, waving her arms and shouting my name, trying to get my attention. The feeling that came over me was hard to describe. It was like a cold shock running through my body. The only way I can explain it is that it felt like I was seeing a ghost. I honestly questioned whether I was losing my mind for a second. I yelled out my window and told her to turn right and pull over on the first side street, which was just ahead. We both parked and got out of our cars. I walked up to her and I was completely speechless, just stuttering, not even sure what to say. She must have seen how confused I looked because she just stepped forward and gave me a hug. And she was completely solid. I could feel her arms around me. At that point I knew, okay, she's not a ghost. I told her how I'd heard she died, how I'd grieved, how I'd seen the obituary and the news article. She looked at me like I was halfway crazy, but I tried to explain that everything I had seen, her name, the accident, the location, matched exactly. And that's where things got even stranger. According to her, the accident absolutely did happen. It was a really bad crash. She had just gotten out of the hospital a couple of weeks before we ran into each other. She had actually spent months there. The first 30 days she was in a coma, and after that she went through multiple surgeries and a long recovery. So the accident was real. The location I remembered was correct. The timeline matched. The only thing that didn't match was the part where she died. Later that same day, I tried to find the obituary and the news article again. I searched everywhere. Nothing. They were completely gone. And that's the part I've never been able to explain. For a long time, I tried to convince myself that maybe it was someone else with the same name, maybe in a nearby town. But I've never been able to find anything like that either. And her last name is rare enough that the odds of someone else with the exact same name, in a similar accident in the same area, feel incredibly small. So I don't know what happened. Maybe I misunderstood something. Maybe I saw the wrong information online. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something stranger than that. a glitch or a moment where the timeline didn't quite line up the way it should have.
Next, a student reads that her friend Dwight was murdered, then wakes up to find Friday starting over and Dwight alive, as if the tragic day never happened.
I was a senior in high school in South Bend, Indiana. I remember that Friday clearly because I was excited about what we had planned after school. Our drama class was finally going to have the first full run-through of a play we were opening in about 2 weeks. The day was dragging the way it always does when you're waiting for something you're excited about. Drama class was third period, and during class someone mentioned they hadn't seen Dwight in second period. Right away, I knew what that meant. Dwight had one of the major roles in the play, and he wasn't double cast. If he wasn't there, the run-through wouldn't happen. It would have been pointless without him. But during drama class, something strange happened. The principal and the drama teacher came into the auditorium, but they never actually started class. Instead, they stood near the back of the room, talking quietly. They kept stepping out into the hallway and coming back in again. Nobody gave us anything to do. That was unusual because our drama teacher didn't tolerate people just sitting around. He was the kind of guy who always had us working on something. But that day we just sat there. It turned into a free period and everyone kept wondering what was going on. After school, I went down to the theater area where we usually worked on scenery and props. But when I got there, there was a sign on the door that said, "No activities." That really surprised me. We were only 2 weeks from opening night, and normally everyone would be scrambling to get things finished. So I walked home. When I got there, the South Bend Tribune had already been tossed onto our porch. I picked it up, sat down, and opened it. Right on the front page it said, "Central High School student slain." There was a picture of Dwight. The same Dwight who hadn't been in second period. And suddenly the strange behavior at school made sense. The teachers hadn't told us anything yet. They were waiting for us to hear it from our families or see it on the news that night. The thing is, I really looked up to Dwight. I admired him a lot. His father was a minister, and Dwight was one of the best people I'd ever known. I honestly thought he was going to grow up and follow in his father's footsteps. When I read that article, I was furious. Not at anyone in particular, but at God. I ran upstairs. At the time, I had been studying Catholicism, and I had a small altar set up in my room. I rushed in there and started throwing all the religious items across the room. I was yelling, "How could you let this happen? How could you let this happen?" I couldn't even go back downstairs. I spent the whole evening crying and pacing and getting angry all over again. I went to bed still upset. The next morning, I woke up and my eyes were still wet from crying. It was Saturday, and all I could think about was what had happened. Dwight had been killed Thursday. The news came out Friday, and now it was Saturday morning. I was standing at the window looking out into the backyard when my younger brother walked in on his way to the bathroom. He was about 3 years younger than me. He said, "What's the matter?" I didn't want him to see me crying, so I just waved him off and said, "Go away." But he kept asking. Finally, I said, "Dwight, Dwight." He looked confused and said, "What do you mean? What about Dwight?" I said, "Where have you been? He's dead." My brother just stared at me. "Dead? Why?" I said, "Didn't you read the paper?" And he said, "I don't know what you're talking about, but you better get moving. You're going to be late for school." I said, "Late for school? It's Saturday. Dwight was killed Thursday. It was in Friday's paper." He shook his head and said, "It's Friday morning." I couldn't believe what I was hearing, so I went downstairs to check the newspaper. We also got the Chicago Tribune delivered in the mornings. I grabbed it and looked at the date. It said Friday. Then I ran to the den where the South Bend Tribune was, the one with Dwight's picture in it the day before. But now the paper said Thursday. It was like Friday had started all over again. I went to school that day, and the whole day played out completely differently than the Friday I remembered. In the first 2 periods, nothing strange happened. And when I got to drama class, I asked if anyone had seen Dwight. Someone said, "Yeah, he was in second period." Nothing bad had happened. Later that day, I saw Dwight standing in the cafeteria lunch line. When I spotted him, I walked right up to him. I said, "Dwight, you have no idea how glad I am to see you. I don't know how to explain this, but yesterday, you were dead." Yesterday's Friday. So somehow, I had lived through 2 Fridays, one where Dwight was killed and one where he wasn't. And people always want to say it must have been a dream. But it didn't feel like a dream. It was a full day. Every class, every moment, every second. 2 Fridays in a row, one tragic, and one where everything was suddenly fine again.
Up next, 3 friends buy beer at 10:10 p.m., drink by the river for what feels like hours. But when they go inside, the clock says 10:12.
In 1995, in High River, Alberta, something happened to me, my girlfriend, and a close friend that we still can't explain. It felt like some kind of time anomaly. At the time, I was living in a house right along the Highwood River. My backyard went straight down to the riverbank, and there was this big log sitting near the water that we liked to hang out on. One night, we took a few beers down there, sat on the log, and just talked for a while. Nothing strange happened while we were out there. It felt like a normal evening, just a few drinks, a pack of cigarettes, and good conversation. Earlier that night, we had been bowling. We left the bowling alley right as they were about to close. There was a liquor store attached to the bowling alley, so we stopped in and grabbed a 12-pack to bring back to my place. The clerk wasn't thrilled with us because the store closed at 10 p.m., and we ended up holding things up a little. We paid around 10:10 and headed out. After that, we went back to my house, walked down to the river, and sat on that log like we always did. Eventually, we finished the beers and decided to head inside. When I walked into the house, I glanced at the clock, and it said 10:12. I remember thinking that couldn't possibly be right. I figured the clock battery must be dying or something. So I checked the time on my computer to reset it. The computer also said 10:12. Now I'm standing there thinking, that makes no sense. We had just driven from the liquor store, gone down to the river, sat there long enough to drink a 12-pack between the 3 of us, smoked a full pack of cigarettes, and talked for a while. There's no way all of that happened in 2 minutes. At first, I thought maybe someone was messing with me somehow. Back then, you could call a phone number to hear the official time and temperature, so I dialed it. The recording confirmed it was now 10:15. That's when I checked the receipt from the liquor store. Sure enough, it showed the purchase time as 10:10 p.m. So somehow, we left the liquor store, went back to my house, sat by the river, drank 12 beers, smoked a pack of cigarettes, and hung out for what felt like a normal stretch of time. But according to every clock we checked, only a couple of minutes had passed. We weren't chugging beers or chain-smoking cigarettes. It felt like a normal, relaxed hangout. The only way I can make sense of it is that time moved differently for us for a little while. Whenever I tell people this story, most of them assume we just got drunk and mixed up about the time. But that receipt is what always stuck with me. It still says 10:10, and I know what the clock said when we walked back inside.
Next up, 2 travelers open a motel room in 1996 Ohio and briefly see a woman dressed in clothes from the 1960s, only for the room to suddenly appear modern and empty.
Back in 1996, I was traveling for work in a small town in southern Ohio. Late in the afternoon, my coworker and I decided to grab a room at a little motel so we could finish some paperwork before heading out to find dinner. The place was small, maybe 30 rooms, and looked like it had been built sometime in the 1950s. It was the kind of motel where you park right outside your door. Since I traveled a lot, I always asked for a room as far away from the office traffic as possible, and the clerk gave us the last room on the left. The whole place was shaped like an L, with the office sitting near the middle. We parked the van, grabbed our things, and walked to the room. As soon as I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the first thing that hit me was how old the room looked. It felt like stepping straight into the 1960s. The furniture, the colors, everything about it looked dated, but at the same time, it all seemed brand new. Then something strange happened. A door at the back of the room, the bathroom door, opened and a young woman stepped out. She looked to be in her 20s, and she was dressed in what looked like early 1960s clothes, with a hairstyle to match. The second she saw the 2 of us standing there, she started screaming and rushed back into the bathroom. We immediately started apologizing and backed out of the room, thinking we had walked in on someone by mistake. Assuming the motel must have double-booked the room, we went straight back to the office and explained what had happened. The clerk looked confused and said there definitely shouldn't be anyone in that room. According to him, only 3 rooms were rented that night. He walked back with us to check. When he unlocked the door and opened it, the room looked completely different. Everything inside was modern. The furniture, the layout, none of it looked like what we had just seen. And there was no one there. I got the feeling the clerk thought we were messing with him, but we weren't. We stayed the night, and nothing else unusual happened. But I've thought about that moment a lot over the years. Sometimes I wonder if we somehow stepped into a glitch in time for a few seconds. And if that's the case, maybe somewhere back in the 1960s, there was a young woman who suddenly saw 2 strange men standing in her motel room and had no idea how they got there.
Next, a student returns to her locked hostel room and finds strangers living there, only for everything to return to normal when she comes back later.
This happened in 2022, during my 4th year of college. I had been living in hostels the entire time I was there, and every year we were assigned a different building or room, so moving around was pretty normal. That year I had been given a room on the 2nd floor, S72, and I'd already been living there for about a month. One day I went down to the mess like usual. After eating, I came back to the hostel, walked up to the 2nd floor, and headed down the hallway to my room. When I got to S72, the door was open. That immediately caught my attention because I always locked it when I left. Then I heard voices coming from inside. I knocked on the door and 2 girls came out. At that point, I was confused and honestly a little nervous. I told them that this was my room. One of the girls looked at me and said something like, "You must be new. I think you've got the wrong room." That made it even stranger because I knew I wasn't mistaken. I had been living there for weeks. My things were in there. I knew exactly where I was standing. For a moment, I just stood there, completely confused. I was outside the room I knew was mine, being told by someone else that it wasn't. So I left and went to another hostel where one of my friends was staying. She was in a different building because she was in another program. I told her everything that had just happened, and we decided to go back together. When we got there, everything looked normal again. My room door was closed and locked just like I had left it. No one was inside. To this day, my friend still thinks I was joking about the whole thing. But 2022 into 2023 was a really strange time for me. A lot of things happened that I still can't fully explain.
For our final story of the evening, a night shift worker wakes to find the balcony door open and watches a smiling version of himself climb the railing and jump into the fog.
This happened when I was living with a flatmate and working night shifts. One night I got home around 2:30 in the morning. My flatmate worked as ground staff at the airport, and her schedule rotated every week. That night, she wasn't supposed to be home until around 6:30 a.m. I had a small private balcony off my room, and during the winter, I always kept the door shut. It could drop to 1 or 2 degrees Celsius at night, and since the house didn't have central heating, keeping that door closed was the only way to keep my room from turning into an icebox. We had small room heaters, but they only did so much. So when I walked into my room and saw the balcony door open, it immediately felt strange. I clearly remembered closing it before leaving for work. Still, I figured maybe my flatmate had come home early and stepped out there for a minute. I didn't think too much about it. I shut the balcony door, turned off the outside light, took a shower, changed, and got into bed. By about 3 a.m., I was settled in. What was odd, though, was that I fell asleep almost immediately. Normally, it takes me close to an hour to fall asleep after work. That night, I don't even remember drifting off. About an hour later, I woke up feeling cold. I opened my eyes and saw that the balcony door was open again, and the outside light was on. I remember thinking, that's not possible. I had just closed it. I was certain of it. From my bed, I had a diagonal view of the balcony, so if anyone was standing out there, I would have been able to see them. I was just about to get up and close the door again when something moved out of the shadows and into the light. It was me. I watched as this version of me stepped fully into the light and climbed up onto the steel railing of the balcony. Once it was standing on top of the railing, it turned and looked straight back into the room, right at me, and it smiled. But the smile was wrong, way too wide, like there were too many teeth. Then it jumped off the balcony and disappeared into the fog below. I just sat there in bed, frozen. Not because I couldn't move, but because I didn't even know how to process what I had just seen. After a couple of minutes, I finally forced myself up, walked over, shut the balcony door again, and turned off the outside light. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. Even now, I have no explanation for what I saw. Every time I think about it, it still gives me chills. A few days later, I came down with a really high fever. My flatmate actually slept in my room for a couple nights to keep an eye on me. At one point, she told me that I was mumbling strange, nonsensical things in my sleep. I took some over-the-counter medicine and eventually recovered. Nothing else unusual happened before or after that. I will say, though, that flat always made me uneasy. Sometimes the feeling was strong enough that I'd just lock myself in my room for the night. I never actually saw anything else there. It was more of a constant sense that something about the place wasn't quite right. Most of the time, though, everything felt completely normal, which almost makes that night even harder to explain.
That's all for tonight, dear listeners. Glitches in the Matrix are strange because they don't come with clear edges. No creature in the tree line, no craft hovering overhead. Just ordinary moments where the timeline suddenly doesn't line up anymore. A few missing hours, a road you don't remember driving, a place you shouldn't already be. Most of the people in these stories went right back to their normal lives afterward, but somewhere in the back of their mind, there's always that one question that never quite goes away. What the hell just happened to me? If you've ever had something like this happen to you, I'd love to hear about it. If you want to become a Patreon cult member to get extended episodes and other full Patreon-only episodes, you can sign up at patreon.com/campfirecultpod for only $5 a month. And please remember, if you want to support this podcast and love a damn good cup of coffee, head on over to outlandscoffee.com and use code CAMPFIRE for $5 off your first order and give us a try. Until next time, I'll be leaving you in the dark where whispers linger and shadows dance. Stay weary, sleep well, and beware the whispers in the night. If you have a story to tell, please reach out via email at contact@campfirecultpod.com or leave me a voicemail message at 720-297-8608. You can follow us anywhere on social media at Campfire Cult Pod and online at campfirecultpod.com. And finally, if you don't mind, please rate and review wherever possible.